All right, welcome to the third act in a ongoing series on Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This series is part of a four-part series, so if you haven't seen the first two parts, I recommend going and watching those before tuning into this stream. Each part is mirroring each of the four parts of the actual text of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So this video series can be used as a companion to reading that book, as an introduction to basic concepts, as an introduction to the logical progression of Nietzsche's thought in that book. So with that being said, let's jump into Act 3. And the naming of each of these acts is my own sort of free creativity, let's say. Because Nietzsche himself does not name the acts. I named the first act The Overman, because I felt like Nietzsche was giving a overview of the basic perspective of the Overman and his sort of initial sort of introduction to mankind. Act 2, I named The Society, because it was really a meditation on many of the social aspects of specifically Christian and European society that Nietzsche was observing from the perspective of the Overman. And part 3, I think, should be called The Pathway, because it is really Nietzsche's attempt to articulate what the nature of the path of an Overman looks like. What are some of the experiences one will encounter on this pathway? And what should you be prepared to confront both outside and inside yourself as you are walking the path of the Overman? Before getting into the content itself, I just want to announce that this is also a preparation for a course that will be running throughout the summer and starting July 15th, 2002 on Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This video series is also a great way to prepare for that course. You'll have sort of a vision of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and with that in hand, you'll be able to really dive deeply into this book this summer with the help of the course. So if you're interested in that, there are 3 different tiers available. Check out philosophyportal.online for more information. And hopefully I will see you on July 15th in the course itself. As it relates to Act 3, there are 16 major concepts here that we're going to explore as it relates to the path of the Overman. We start as we start every section, and I'm trying to also make connections throughout this series with the meta-level oscillations that are going on throughout all of the acts, which sort of bring the book together. I think the most salient sort of meta-level oscillation that we see is this deep withdrawal and deep engagement with the world simultaneously. So as in the previous acts, we find the character of Zarathustra starting Act 3 in a deep isolation. However, this time his isolation is more active. He's not in a cave. He is wandering. He is specifically hiking. And that will be important for setting up this idea that part 3 is best, I think, represented as the pathway. So starting with the Wanderer, Nietzsche is basically trying to communicate the importance of not only solitude, not only sort of a passive withdrawal away from the rabble, away from humankind, where you can really fill up your heart and revitalize your senses, but also is emphasizing long walks and hikes And that could be taken literally, like you should literally go on long walks and long hikes in solitude as a great way to um, just basically spend time with yourself, to become more familiar with your natural thinking process. However, it's also and simultaneously a metaphor, and this comes across very clearly in the text, for the greatest heights and the greatest depths. This is a theme that will characterize the pathway, which is the simultaneity of the greatest heights and the greatest depths. In other words, you're not just walking in a straight line, you're walking incredible heights, and you're descending into incredible depths. And for Nietzsche, if you are someone who is striving for the greatest, you should be prepared also for the deepest, and the deepest being some of the most painful emotions, being some of the most extreme negative emotions. So for Nietzsche, there is no height without depth. There is no greatness without suffering. And the wanderer and also the hiking metaphor in the mountains is a great way to communicate that. And it's also important to keep this in mind, this idea of a wanderer hiking. It's important to keep this in mind as we develop deeper into this chapter, because there's another metaphor which Nietzsche employs, which is essential to his thinking, which is connected and extended upon this metaphor of the man hiking in the mountains towards great heights. But that's sort of how this sort of sets the tone for the chapter. This is sort of him sort of saying, and especially, the overman's journey and path can be a solitary one and a lonely one, and one in which you are confronted with the most difficult and extreme images in your own mind. So with that being said, let's go to the loneliest vision. So in this wandering, in this hiking, in this journey towards the most extreme dimensions of our experience, the greatest and the deepest, Nietzsche claims that we must confront in silence what he calls the loneliest vision, which is connected again to this metaphor of the striving for the greatness and the depths, which is that the one who strives for the highest must also be aware, and confront this inside oneself, that one will inevitably fall. And this is connected to the idea of the spirit of gravity. The spirit of gravity, and we'll talk more about the spirit of gravity, but the spirit of gravity is an essential Nietzschean concept. He, throughout the book, calls the spirit of gravity his arch enemy. And he positions the overman as an agent of flight against the spirit of gravity, which again, we'll talk about more. However, in order to fly, one has to confront the loneliest vision, and that is the vision of falling. And the vision of falling is also, I suppose, connected to this idea in Christian mythology of the fall, that man is fallen. And throughout Nietzsche's work, he is going to be committed to this idea that man can fly. And that's, again, against this image of the fact that we're fallen and with the spirit of gravity. But I think the most difficult thing about the loneliest vision is that oftentimes people don't strive for the greatest potentiality in themselves because they know this loneliest vision all too well. The reasoning goes something along the lines of, well, why should I strive for the greatest if it's inevitable that I'm going to fall? Why should I strive for the greatest? Think about anyone who's ever achieved anything great. Of course, that they haven't maintained that greatness forever. The greatest philosopher, the greatest athlete, the greatest musician, the greatest politician, the greatest whatever it is that you're striving for in your greatness has fallen. And of course, we all die. So the inevitability of falling is something that one has to, even if it comes to all of us naturally, one has to really labor with this image To be able to process it means that one does not use it as an excuse for not striving for the highest. That one still strives for the highest, even though you know your fall. And this connected to Act 1, which is that if you fall in your striving for the greatness, that Nietzsche sees this as extraordinarily virtuous. So he does not fault anyone for falling. What he faults people for is not striving. That's really what this loneliest vision is all about. So next, I had a hard time naming this concept, but I ended up concluding that desiring division was the best way to articulate it. And the idea of desiring division is connected to the loneliest vision, which is that you shouldn't block the most disturbing images in yourself, the most disturbing visions in yourself. For example, the loneliest vision that you will inevitably fall, and really confronting and wrestling with that. The overman is constantly counterintuitive. So in this section, I think we get perhaps the overman expressing things which are at the height of this counterintuitive nature, which is that most chase a feeling of unity, that most feel like they would like to be in a unity of togetherness with other people and a happiness. In other words, a striving for this wholeness, a striving for this, I guess, intuitive vision of harmony with the other, with oneself. But the overman doesn't do this, and he makes this very clear that and in this passage he explicitly says that he's chasing division, he's chasing solitude, he's chasing suffering. He wants to experience division and solitude and suffering. And another counterintuitive aspect about this section is that he says he's chasing these things, and he is at the same time struggling with the fact that he is happy. That he calls it an unwilling bliss, which is a really interesting turn of phrase. And he actually states explicitly that this unwilling bliss is with him against his will, because he doesn't chase women, funny enough. And that's another theme throughout Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is the theme of women, the place of man and woman in this path of the overman. In any case, you get this idea that because he has explored the deepest, loneliest parts of himself, that now there's a sort of natural happiness which he doesn't have to strive for, but just is with him. And at the same time, even though it is with him in his solitude, he's still searching out for those uncomfortable cracks in his own being. There's this, I think this is mostly connected to this idea that the overman is constantly in a type of self-war with himself. The overman is constantly willing to go places inside of himself that most actively avoid. And so you get this idea of a tremendous will. A tremendous will, to not be enslaved to the most impulsive, to the most easy, to the path of least action, let's say, that the overman goes above and beyond. The overman stays up all night, waiting to encounter something in himself, which would be a sign of suffering or a sign of something that he's not comfortable confronting in himself, something like this, that he is actively searching these dimensions of himself in his striving. And in this section, after sort of his long walks, his long meditations with the loneliest vision, after his staying up all night, chasing loneliness and chasing division and chasing suffering. He comes back to his cave and gives a type of meditation on solitude, and specifically connecting the notion of solitude to home. And that's an interesting way to think about solitude, because I've often in my own self wrestled with the idea of home as a concept. What does home mean for me? Especially when you have sort of disconnected from your natural given home, and have become more of a wanderer on the planet. What is home? Well, for the Overman, the idea is that the home is solitude, meaning that wherever you are alone, wherever you have cultivated that inward bliss, after having confronted the deepest negativities in oneself, that solitude and that wherever you are is basically home. And I think that that's important, because a lot of people try to go on vacations. A lot of people try to get away from themselves, precisely because there's something inside themselves that they don't want to confront. So it's a weird thing, because even if you go on a vacation to get away from yourself, you're still going to be with yourself. So you can't escape yourself, is basically what the Overman's trying to say here. What Nietzsche's trying to say through the Overman is that you better get used to yourself. You better get used to your solitude, because that's ultimately what you're going to have as your most, let's say, constant home. And I think as you get older, the more important that idea is, the more lonely things can possibly be. And so the more you should become acquainted with the time with yourself. And one of the interesting things he says in this meditation is that all of your feelings and all of your reasons can be held in solitude. In other words, there are some really uncomfortable feelings and uncomfortable reasons inside oneself, which might give other people pause, which might make other people squirm or feel uncomfortable or reject you, or whatever it might be. But judged, for example, someone might judge you. But the idea here of solitude as home is that all of your feelings and all of your reasons can be held. And so he's really trying to emphasize that's one of the reasons why solitude is your home, is because can you accept everything inside of yourself? Can you accept all of the feelings? Can you accept all of the reasons? And he's saying solitude can hold these things, and you can accept these things. And so there's a way in which the intimate connection with solitude allows for a metamorphosis of all of your feelings and all of your reasons, which is necessary to really be a true, to walk a true path. And then we get an interesting meditation on the night sky. So he's in solitude, he's outside of his cave, he's looking up at the night sky. It's gorgeous. And there's, again, the night sky as connected with the mountain climbing is, you can interpret it literally, but I think it's most powerful if you interpret it metaphorically. Just think about the sky and think about the way the sky feels when you're staring into a huge expanse, open expanse over your head at night with the stars out. Nietzsche says that this sky is a height, is a silence, is a clarity, which teaches the overcoming of the self. And here's where we get the connection to the mountains, which I said hold on to as we work through this section. Because he says, the sky teaches a flying beyond climbing. In other words, if the long wandering mountain climbing in the heights and the depths is a metaphor for what's necessary to overcome the self, then the sky itself is this overcoming as such. It's the flying beyond climbing. He says it's the rolling of the dice. So what we get here is the idea of a being, namely the overman, who is no longer held down by the weight of gravity, by the spirit of gravity, here connected to the loneliest vision of the inevitable fall. But we get an individual who's free from gravity. It's kind of like the frame or the container for gravitational forces, as opposed to being one of the objects which is sort of enslaved to that force in Nietzsche's sort of way of relating to the force of gravity. And there's a type of openness here where he connects to the rolling of the dice, which is because you are no longer tethered by the weight of the world and the fall and the spirit of gravity, you're willing to take chances. You're willing to take risks. You're willing to roll the dice. You're willing to see which way things will fall, not in a deterministic way, not in a calculated, pre-programmed way. But there's a type of openness to being. There's a type of genuine striving that includes within itself surprise, which includes within itself the willingness to encounter the unknown in a very deep way. And I think that this willingness to take chances and risks and surprise and experience the unknown, this is very childlike, because I think for Nietzsche, the child is not so much possessed by the spirit of gravity. But it's also very, very, I guess, Nietzsche's wisdom as it relates to the nature of accidents and contingency, that most people are, without knowing it, perhaps traumatized by the fact that the universe has an accidental or a contingent nature to it, which is perhaps why he thinks that the idea of God or the idea of determinism is a type of metaphysical symptom, to prevent confronting sort of this more disturbing aspect, let's say, of the universe. But what most people consider a disturbing aspect of the universe, for Nietzsche, in his childlike yay saying, this is the greatest gift. And he has some great lines in this section about replacing the deterministic rationality, which calculates and pre-programs everything, with a more open, dice rolling, chance taking joy. Is really one of the most important aspects of the Overman. And that's connected, I think, to the solar will. And the solar will is one, it's something which he's cultivated in himself in his solitude. Again, as a meta oscillation connected throughout Thus Spoke Zarathustra, there's this building up of an overflowingness within oneself, which you could connect to the solar will. But here we're seeing the overflowingness as a more active force. We're seeing the overflowingness as the overman's own striving. And specifically, the solar will gives this idea, which has been communicated in other sections as well, which is that it doesn't really matter the external circumstances. The external circumstances are mostly irrelevant to the solar will. Is it hot? Is it cold? Am I rich? Am I poor? Is it a storm or is it calm? These things don't matter so much. What matters so much is that the solar will in itself is on fire. And so your capacity or capability to endure and enjoy what is in some sense unperturbed by the external circumstances, where I suppose he's giving the idea here that most people are being willed outside of themselves, are are being tossed around by the world, by the accidents and the contingencies which are traumatizing them. But the solar will is in some sense a qualitative shift in the very nature of willing, the very nature of the experience of the being here that we're trying to understand. And this brings us to perhaps one of the most important concepts in all of Nietzsche's work, the eternal return, certainly one of the most famous concepts in all of Nietzsche's work. And in this section, he's introducing the concept formally for the first time. And the way he introduces the concept is very interesting, and it's something that I've had to meditate on for a long time. And I'm sure I'll be meditating on it for a long time into the future. In no way have I resolved what Nietzsche's talking about with the eternal return. It's more something that I think he is framing in such a way that it stays with you and that you're struggling with it for a long time. But in any case, how he first introduces it is with this idea of an infinite backwards and an infinite outwards, or an infinite past and an infinite future. And both of these paths, he says, are underneath the gateway called moment. So he's trying to identify here a contradiction of time. He said, if we were to walk this pathway into the past forever, if we were to walk this pathway outward into the future forever, would these two pathways contradict each other eternally? In other words, does the past and the future just extend forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and never stopping, never reconciling this contradiction? Or do these two paths meet, forming a type of circle? Now, both of these intuitive thoughts, you can think about the past and the future as just extending, continuing on forever and ever and ever as straight lines. You can also think about the past and the future as slightly curved in such a way as that they eventually meet, kind of like if you look at the earth and think it's straight, but if you walked in a straight line around the earth, you'd come back to where you were, like it was a circle. And he seems to negate both of these possibilities. So he negates, this is my interpretation, he's negating the idea of time as a straight line, and he's also negating the idea of time as a circle. And he does that explicitly in this section, to be honest. What he's trying to get at here with this contradiction of time, and sort of emphasizing that it's not a line or a circle, is that if time did exist in this way, that all possibilities would be exhausted, that we would be doomed to repetition, that we would be doomed to things repeating the way they are. Because there would be no space for the new. There would be no space for an unexhausted possibility. And I think that's the challenge here with the idea of the eternal return, which I think we'll continue to unpack here as the book continues. Specifically towards the end of this section and also in the fourth act. And I think that's connected to what happens after Nietzsche explores this concept of the eternal return for the first time, which is the concept of aping or mimicry. Because the overman is concerned with the possibility of the new. The overman is concerned with exploring realms of being that have never been explored before. He'll often talk about islands of life that have yet to be explored, that there are thousands of possibilities yet to be explored. And he meets what he calls Zarathustra's ape. And Zarathustra's ape says all of the things that Zarathustra might say, but you get the feeling like it's very shallow. You get the feeling like it doesn't come from the same source of depth and greatness as when Zarathustra is speaking. So you get this idea that Zarathustra's ape is someone who has maybe read a lot of books, maybe read a lot of Zarathustra's writings, Nietzsche's writings, but that they're not really coming from, one, a true source, and deeper than that, that they're coming from a dark motive. Specifically, he says the motive of revenge, because he didn't get enough attention in his own creativity, so that he has to mimic and ape other people. And he tells his ape to shut up, basically. And you must go into solitude. You must go into solitude. You must go away. You must go on an adventure. You must really do something and what he's trying to say here is that you must really do something which opens up the possibility for a true, authentic differentiation from me. In other words, we can fall into idol worship. And this is something that's throughout Thus Spoke Zarathustra. We can fall into idol worship. And Zarathustra is, I think, saying idols might be necessary as a process of coming to be. They can be useful. But ultimately, overcome your idols, destroy your idols. On the other hand, if you're walking the path of the overman, you might have people who are starting to idolize you. And he says, do not identify with this idolization. Break the tables. Break the tables. The overall idea here, again, connected to this idea of the eternal return, is that the overman is concerned with not mimicry, not imitation simply. It's more stimulation, more motivation. And being in touch with your true motivations. Are your true motives dark? Are your true motives coming from revenge? How can you know unless you go and really walk a path that forces you to confront your own idiosyncratic nature? Piety. So this is directly connected with aping and something I already touched on, which is that he states explicitly that the overman must avoid people identifying in you. So in the same way as that you want to avoid mimicking and idolizing other people to the extremes where you have no contact with yourself, you have no contact with your own motivation and your own differentiation. The overman emphasizes that don't turn, in negating God, don't turn yourself into a God. And, we could debate whether or not the people who have been motivated by Nietzsche in the 20th century and beyond are guilty of this to some degree. It's worth thinking about. He's saying basically that it's another trap. It's one thing to negate God, but we have to do you could say, a negation of negation as it relates to turning yourself into a God. At the same time, he says that there are possibilities for everyone for what he calls a godliness. He says, no God, but the possibility for godliness. And I think another thing here, if we're thinking about a being who has confronted the loneliest vision, if we're thinking about a being who has a solar will, if we're thinking about a being who's rolling the dice in the night sky, someone who has the qualities of godliness doesn't necessarily need other people identifying them as a God to feel that. There's a way in which there's a positive abyssal nature to the godliness, the overflowingness. Now, one of the most interesting sections in part 3 involves the 3 evils. And these 3 evils come to him in a really fantastical dream. And throughout Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the nature of fantastical dreams is something which is very obvious, it's very frequently used by Zarathustra to communicate essential points. So it's again a great precursor to psychoanalysis in that regard. In any case, in the dream, the world is presented to him. Specifically, he says, to be weighed, almost as if he is able to judge the world, to weigh the world from God's perspective, the God who does not exist. I suppose this is connected to, there's the potentiality for godliness inside everyone. And so this type of vision is possible within everyone, I think he's trying to say. In any case, he chooses on his own free will that he would like to weigh the things. He says something very curious. He says he would like to weigh the three best worst things. He says specifically the three best worst things. The first best worst thing is sex. The second is power. And the third is selfishness. And each he gives a type of dialectical analysis, perhaps the deepest dialectical analysis related to sexuality. And there's some great lines here about sexuality. He says, on the one hand, sexuality is shamed by the body haters. But on the other hand, sex needs to be protected from the pigs. So you get this idea that we should affirm sexuality as opening up the most precious positive experiences. On the other hand, you do need to have strong boundaries as it relates to sexuality, because you can't let the pigs in. So this is his basic sort of ethical balancing act as it relates to sexuality. Second, power, he mostly only has a negativity to communicate, which is that those who strive for power, and this might be counterintuitive for those who have a simplistic interpretation of the will to power. In any case, he says this type of striving for social power, to become a master, to become a ruler, is for the cold, is for the hard, and for the vain. And when he says these things, he's not saying them in a positive light. There's certain aspects of Zarathustra's character which could see coldness and hardness as a positive thing, but not in this context. He sees coldness and hardness and vanity, and also the inevitable downfall for those who strive for power. So he's not really here articulating a positive view in terms of striving for worldly power. But I have to say that this is, in some sense, there is a contradiction here, which I think can be made sense of in a very interesting way when we encounter Zarathustra's approach to what he calls the rulers of the earth. But that's not what he's necessarily talking about here. Right here, he's talking about more of a warning for those who are really seeking social power. And finally, selfishness. Here, he unequivocally thinks about selfishness as positive. He is saying that we need to reclaim the term selfishness. And that for the most virtuous in the soul and the body, selfishness is a tremendously important and powerful act that one should explore. And that's why he's saying that solitude is home. There's a way in which someone who goes deep into solitude is going to be seen by the others as selfish, perhaps, as antisocial. Here he's linking selfishness to the highest virtue. Spirit of gravity. So I said we would encounter this concept. I've already introduced a little bit about this concept, but we have to go deeper into it. As I've already said, Nietzsche's Zarathustra sees spirit of gravity as his arch enemy. He says it's the arch enemy of humanity. I think it's connected to the fall in Christian mythology and metaphysics. The spirit of gravity is trying to communicate a being pulled down. the spirit of gravity is trying to be communicating a burdensome weight, which prevents us from seeing and being with, again, the metaphor of the sky. And in order to communicate sort of what he means with the human's relationship to the sky, he says we should combat the spirit of gravity by learning to fly. But again, connected to the metaphor of the mountains, he says we should first learn how to walk, run, dance, climb before we can fly. All of these are metaphors for spirit. And specifically this metaphor, and he says, once humans learn how to fly, you get this idea that there's some irreversible transition, some qualitative break to a different type of being. So flight is extraordinarily important for Nietzsche in this work. But here you get the specific idea this metaphor is trying to communicate a breaking of limits, which is again a theme in Thus Spoke Zarathustra as it relates to values and virtues, that you have to break the tables. What people think of as the limits, you have to transgress them. So there's constantly this dialectic, which I think is important in Nietzsche, which is a dialectic between limitation and transgression of limitation. A setting of limits and a breaking of limits. And the very act of breaking the limits is the daringness to fly. The limitations themselves are more on the level of the spirit of gravity. So connected to new virtues. This is, again, connected because the spirit of gravity, the limits are the tables, the virtues that we've been given when we are underneath a metaphysics of a universal good and evil. Nietzsche here is saying what that's covering over is the singularity of good and evil. He says many times the overman finds his own good and evil, and that human knowledge of good and evil, he says, is at best incomplete. And this is this idea of, okay, we've been laboring under a metaphysics which has told us that in some sense, implicitly, good and evil, or explicitly, good and evil are complete. We know what good and evil are. Nietzsche constantly gives you this idea that the greatest good and also the deepest, darkest evil have yet to even been touched by humanity. And that's interesting to think about in the context of the 20th century. That's extremely interesting to think about in the context of the 21st century. That what we know of good and evil has yet to be written. It's in the process of being written. It's in the process of being created. That's the role of the overman. You get this idea that no matter the universality of a certain symbolic law, that this universality is not all, that this universality has a gap in it. And that gap for the overman, as someone who has made his or her nest out of an abyss, is the place where new virtues, where new discoveries of good and evil can be made. Next concept, recovering spirits. So this articulates basically a relationship between depth and surface, which is something we discussed in Act 2 as it related to the fiery mountain. And it's extraordinarily important in Nietzsche's overall philosophy, this relationship between depth and surface. And it's also connected to what we talked about opening this act as it related to the wandering of the greatest heights and the lowest depths. Throughout the book, there's this idea that Nietzsche tries to communicate, which is that there's a thought inside of him which is so abyssal that it would knock him unconscious. And what that's trying to articulate is an ethic of bringing the darkest depth, the ethic of speaking what cannot be spoken, to the surface. This is something which is a meta-level struggle for the character of Zarathustra throughout the book, is what he struggles with. There's some times where he's communicating to other people what they'll be struggling with on the path of the Overman. When he's talking about bringing the most abyssal thought to the surface, he's talking about what he's struggling with. And you get this idea that it's somehow connected to breaking out of the eternal return of the same. In any case, what is here being ultimately communicated is that, let's say, the recovery of your spirit is on the line here. And that the task of the Overman is not just to go into the depths for the depth's sake, but ultimately the truth and the point of the process lies on the surface. It's what you can bring to the surface that matters, not the abyssal depths in themselves. In that sense, I think it's a little bit against some of the principles and some of the intuitions of depth psychology, in the sense that it's not necessarily about the depths so much as it's more about the truth as a surface phenomenon, which the Overman provides a greater depth to. And that's definitely connected to longing, which is a longing for the recovery of spirit, a longing for the new, a longing for the truth, a longing for the courage to be able to say what cannot be said, a longing for the courage and the drive to know one's depths and not to be scared of one's depths, and to be able to survive one's depths on the surface. In that sense, in this section, he's saying we have to remove everything to connect to truth of the soul's freedom. We have to remove all of the debris, all of the dirt, all of the junk that we've connected inside of ourselves. We have to create a clearing for the soul. We have to create a clearing for the soul's freedom and for creation. And here, connected to previous sections, this idea of the redeeming of it was is connected to what really pisses off the will for Nietzsche, is the it was, that the will has no power to change the past. And he says the only way the it was can be redeemed is by the future-oriented freedom of creativity. That we need to create the way we want it to be, which will redeem the it was. That you cannot change the way the past was, but you can create conditions in the present, in a future-oriented present, which in some sense redeems the it was. Doesn't change the it was, but redeems it. And that's you get this idea that that's one of the deepest powers of the soul. And the existence of freedom in the historical process as of the utmost and the highest importance. Okay, so now we're going to have two meditations on eternity. And the reason why we're going to have two meditations on eternity is not only because this concept is just so forcefully presented to you towards the end of Act 3, but because it also, on a superficial reading of Nietzsche, seems to contradict his overall philosophy. There have been sections we've already covered where he's emphasizing there is no such thing as a perfect being, that there's no such thing as eternity, that there's only time and becoming, and that we have to accommodate ourselves and get used to loss. However, there's a paradox here. He says over and over again that joy wants eternity itself. And you get this idea that all of this negation of eternity and perfect being is is you have to get that out of your head as a superficial idea. You have to really explore your soul on a path of becoming. You have to go into your deepest pain. You have to know all the crooks and the cracks of yourself. You have to do that without any image of a perfect being. You have to do that without any image of eternity. You have to confront the fact that maybe you don't want to be alive. You have to confront the fact that, do you really want to be here? And then, and only then, do you start to intimate something inside yourself, a form of joy, which is not necessarily, you get this idea, and I hope we can continue unpacking this in Act 4. But you get this idea that it's not something even that's being willed. It's something which is almost given in a way. Sometimes that's the sense I get. In any case, what is crucial is that if you sit with the deepest midnight, if you sit with the deepest dream, and beyond the pain that's involved in this solitude, that there is a deeper joy, that there is the possibilities of eternity. And I think what he connects to this idea of the ring of rings. I just think that there's a lot of wealth in these sections towards the end of Act 3, which are difficult to really communicate in language, which are probably impossible to communicate in language. He does it very poetically, which is probably the closest one can get. But that there is something related to joy and eternity here. There is a relation. There is something to think here. Now, he starts to use metaphors, and as is typical in Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Nietzsche's work, these are metaphors of life. Just as we use metaphors of the mountain, we use metaphors of the sky. Metaphors of woman and child start to be used here as it relates to a recurrence of joy. What he repeats over and over again is that I have never met another human woman who I would like to have my child, because the only woman that could have my child is eternity. This is basically what he tries to communicate. Now, I think the depths at which this passage is trying to communicate just requires so much meditation. It just requires so much conversation with other people who have also wrestled with the text. What's interesting is that he's using the metaphors of woman and child, which are the foundation for human society in some sense. We have to reproduce ourselves through woman and child. And that he's saying that no human woman or child will do. This is also connected to something to keep in mind for Act 4 as it relates to him calling forth his children. But that only the recurrence of joy with eternity. And there's this weird paradox here with the idea of a recurring joy in eternity, because you get this idea, well, if something is repeating, and you also get this idea that we're not dealing with a normal repetition. I would say we're dealing with a weird repetition here, which it's like a ring which is repeating, but it's always different each time. But you also get this weird thing is, well, how could eternity repeat? So again, the words here he's using, I feel like are pointing towards something really brilliant, but also that words break down in some meaningful way. I think what I really want to emphasize is that it's something related to the energy and the will to power as commonly enacted with women and children by men, to pick the one woman who will have my child, to have the one woman who, there's something precious, there's something sacred, there's something exclusive, there's something closing and at the same time opening the child. which is related to a metaphysics of eternity, which is experienced after walking a long path to really know the deepest abyss of the self and to bring that to the surface. I think that's the best I can do. All right. So let's go over what here is involved in the path to make sense of this as a totality. And again, if you're using these videos as instructive for moving through the book yourself, that's great. If you're moving through these videos as a way to do your own studies, I think these end screens are of the highest utility for you because they're great summary overviews of the act as a whole. So he says, the path to the overman starts with a long solitude and long journeys with great heights and depths. You can't have the great heights without the depths. And you can't walk the path of the overman if you're just constantly with other people, constantly with the rabble. You have to break through towards the depths of your own solitude. That in the depths of your own solitude, you will encounter the most difficult vision as being able to see your greatest heights, but at the same time knowing that you will eventually fall, and that, again, he is not faulting anyone for falling, but he is faulting people for not striving for greatness, which means encountering this loneliest vision. So you must acclimatize your spirit to counterintuitive motions. You have to go towards things which most people wouldn't go towards. They would actively avoid things like division from the other, division from harmony with others, to go into suffering as opposed to joy or pleasure, to go into solitude as opposed to surrounding yourself with other people. These are all things that the overman moves into on its own will, on its own striving. He says solitude eventually becomes your home and is something that can hold all of your most difficult emotions. Whereas other people would not be able to hold all of your most difficult emotions. They wouldn't necessarily be a good home, because your home should be able to hold everything. And Nietzsche claims that solitude is what can hold everything. There's this emptiness which becomes your best friend. He says, the heights and the silence of the sky teaches you how to overcome the self, and from climbing to flying. So we go from walking to running to dancing to climbing to flying. And that flying is connected with a roll of the dice. Flying is connected with surprise. Flying is connected with a type of weightlessness, a type of effortlessness. You have climbed. This is perhaps connected to, again, these metamorphoses of the spirit that we've already covered, related to camel and lion and child. He says, to be one with the sky allows oneself to withstand the uncertainties and the conditions that most would find cold and unbearable. That one here is with a solar will. Again, a nice connection here is if you're in the sky, you get this idea that the flying being is like a star or like a sun, has a solar will. He says, visions of an eternal return emerge from the idea that the past and the future extend indefinitely and exhaust all possibilities. But that this is a burdensome image, that this is something to avoid this nightmare. One must avoid mimicking. One must avoid imitation. One must be inspired by what is. One must be inspired, respect, esteem. All of these are noble dimensions of spirit. But to really go the whole way, you have to understand your own motivations more deeply. Why are you mimicking? Why are you imitating? Why do you respect and esteem something outside of yourself? Ultimately, the overman here, who has a solar will, is kind of his own god in a sense. Now, the other side of that is that not only do you have to avoid people who are not only do you have to avoid turning other people into idols, but you also have to avoid people turning you into an idol. It says, avoid people who are inspired by you and start to identify with you too strongly. Again, there's an issue of degrees here. There's a degree of idolization, which is necessary and healthy. And then there's this emphasis on not absolutizing it to the point where it covers over deeper motivations and deeper tendencies within the self to mask over the real with an idol. Simply, whether that's the other person or you being turned into an idol, is both as dangerous on this path. So moving on to the last box here, we must be careful with sexuality, both hating the body. Think about how easy it is to hate one's own body, to become ashamed of one's own body, to feel like one is not beautiful enough or powerful enough or strong enough. And at the same time, don't be too open with sexuality, not to let the pigs and the partiers in. This dialectic of sexuality, I feel, is very helpful. He also cautions a lusting for power, which is maybe something I emphasized, but didn't emphasize enough, the dimension of the lust for power. And you must be open to a virtuous selfishness, again, connected to the solitude, connected to the isolation, connected to the really getting to know oneself, that we should reclaim a virtuous selfishness. Moving on, then we must learn how to fly, and this is connected to self-love, and create greater values from new experiences, and bring the deepest thoughts to the surface. This is all things that Zarathustra, as the overman, is himself struggling with here in the deepest parts of the path. He's communicating to you that he himself is still struggling with bringing abyssal thoughts to the surface. That in some sense, the creation of greater values from experience is something that's never done. It's incomplete. That the greatest hasn't been achieved yet. That the most evil hasn't been achieved yet. And that learning to fly is essential because the given values and the given virtues are, again, the limits. They're the spirit of gravity. They're holding us to the earth. So we have to learn them. We have to move through them. We have to learn how to walk, run, dance, climb. But ultimately, we have to learn how to fly. And that's related to the creation of new values. That's related to speaking the depths to the surface, which is, again, I think, a good foreshadowing of psychoanalysis. And then finally, we have to confront the deepest longing inside of us for a creative will that redeems the past and has knowledge of an eternal joy. And as I've tried to emphasize, that this knowledge of an eternal joy is a very strange dimension of being. It seems to emerge after a long path. It doesn't seem to be given at the beginning, which I think is Nietzsche's whole point of structuring Thus Spoke Zarathustra in such a way as that you get it out of your head from the start. And you walk the path, and you lose, and you struggle, and you're in pain, and you're suffering, and eternal joy seems impossible and nowhere near you. But nonetheless, at the end of the path, there is something which comes. There is something which is intimated, which is not in another biological human being, but which is somehow connected to the deepest joys and most sacred dimensions of our biological humanness. And so that's the third part. We covered 16, I think, core concepts in Act 3 in a section which I think is best understood as the pathway. And the pathway starts with a long wandering. And we see this long wandering, Nietzsche and Zarathustra, through Zarathustra, confront many difficult things, but ultimately come to this very, very strange dimension of being. This strange dimension of an eternal recurrence, this strange joy which comes after a lot of pain. And I think that will be a great foreshadowing into Act 4, which we'll cover in about a week's time. But I'll just remind you here that on July 15th, we'll be diving even deeper into Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So if you want to join this course, visit philosophyportal.online. The course is ultimately pointing towards a creative, collaborative spirit where there's going to be open discussions and also a collective project where we're going to be able to make sense of Thus Spoke Zarathustra for our time in a very similar way to how I tried to handle the Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit course. There's a conference which we held for that course where it was a student-led conference. So you can see all the presentations there and get a sense for what we're going to be going for with the Thus Spoke Zarathustra course. I think it's going to be even better this time. I think it's going to be even more interesting this time because I have a little deeper understanding of how I'd like to organize and work up to the conference and ultimately also a book. But you're interested, diving deeper, making sense of this yourself, being in a creative community with other people who are striving in the same direction. There are even tiers where you can work with me one-on-one, where you can have long conversations about how all of these complex philosophical notions can be related to in a practical way in your life. Visit philosophyportal.online. Course starts July 15th. And that was Act 3 of 4, Introducing the Pathway. In the fourth act, we'll be covering the leader. It's very interesting how Nietzsche ends Thus Spoke Zarathustra and tries to tie it all together. And I hope you join me for that fourth part. This has been Act 3, and I will sign off here. And again, visit philosophyportal.online if you're interested in joining the course starting July 15th.